Hi everyone and welcome back to 5 Minute Flashback. I'm Ty Ellis Clouser and I will be aiding you in learning about our next topic, the AIDS Memorial Quilt. The AIDS Memorial Quilt was brought to fruition by a man named Cleve Jones in 1985. I know what you're thinking, but no, he's not from Cleveland. Cleve Jones had been a long-time gay activist in San Francisco who was an annual organizer of the Candlelight March to remember San Francisco Supervisor Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone, who had been killed. In 1985, while planning this march as usual, he learned that over 1,000 people in San Francisco had lost their lives to AIDS. He asked the marchers to write the names of their loved ones that died of AIDS on placards. After the regularly scheduled march, they stood on ladders and taped each placard to the federal building in San Francisco. Jones stood back and noticed something. It looked very similar to a patchwork quilt. Jones was inspired and recruited some of his friends to start working on plans for a memorial project. The goal of this project was to document the lives of those lost to AIDS because they feared history would neglect to do so. They also wanted to communicate to people the devastating effects of AIDS. The first panel was created by Cleve Jones himself for his friend Marvin Feldman. Then, in 1987, Jones and some of his friends teamed up to begin the Names Project Foundation. The public responded to the quilt immediately. Donations and panels started coming in from all over the country. Generous donors gave sewing materials and equipment, and the organization was receiving panels from cities most affected by the disease, including Atlanta, New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. On October 11, 1987, the quilt was displayed for the first time for a march of gay and lesbian rights in Washington, D.C. It already included 1,920 panels and took up more space than a football field when it was displayed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. If only I had a quilt that big to get me through Ohio winters. On October 11, 1987, the quilt was displayed for the first time for a march of gay and lesbian rights in Washington, D.C. At sunrise, 6 teams of 8 volunteers unfolded the quilt as celebrities, politicians, friends, families, and lovers read the 1,920 names aloud. Approximately 500,000 people were recorded to have visited the quilt that weekend. After that weekend, the quilt led a national tour across the country in 20 cities. The tour raised almost $500,000 for hundreds of AIDS service organizations. Each city they visited was met with additional panels to be added, and by the end of the tour, the quilt had tripled in size, including more than 6,000 panels. In October 1988, the quilt returned to Washington, D.C., where it had now accumulated 8,288 panels in total for the display on the ellipse in front of the White House. The World Health Organization provided the project a small seed grant, allowing them to travel to 8 different countries, marking the first World AIDS Day on December 1st, 1988. Simultaneously, displays were being broadcast across 6 continents. The quilt went on a second tour in 1989 across 19 cities in the US and Canada and raised nearly $250,000. That's more tours than some musicians get. The quilt was then displayed again on the ellipse of the White House in October, displaying over 12,000 panels. By 1992, the quilt had panels from each of the 50 states and included panels from 28 different countries. In October of that year, the entire quilt returned to the National Mall for display. In January of 1993, the quilt and the Names Project were invited to march in President Clinton's inaugural parade, where over 200 people were needed to carry the quilt panels. As the quilt exists now, it is too large to be displayed all at once on the National Mall. So, in 2012, for the 25th anniversary of the Names Project Foundation, the quilt was shown in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall over 2 weeks, each day consisting of a different 1,500 panel display. The quilt is recorded to be over 54 tons and includes almost 50,000 panels, dedicated to memorializing more than 105,000 people. Each panel is roughly 6 feet by 3 feet, roughly the same size as a grave, and includes cards, letters, documents, and other various objects for those the panels are dedicated to. The quilt continues to be displayed around the world, and it can now be seen virtually too. The idea of one man helped memorialize a whole generation of queer elders and others that would have been lost in history. Now we can proudly say that we know their names and combat the disease in honor of those we lost. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and give us some love on Instagram, all at ZTV 5 Minute Flashback.
This program was produced by ZTV at the University of Akron. Do you want to gain experience in video production, professional social media, or working with real clients? Visit the UA School of Communications online or follow us on social media to learn more. ZTV, make media, make a difference.